Okay, so as Oli said, I'm going to be talking to everyone today about working with genderqueer young people. I'll give you a little bit of a definition of what genderqueer means in a couple of slides. So if that seems completely foreign to you, that's absolutely fine. We will get to that. So to give you an idea of the kind of structure of today's session, I'm going to be giving you an introduction to myself and some key definitions. Then I'm going to be talking to you about the trans context in the UK. So that's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour of some of the discourses that exist around trans people, as well as our responsibilities as social workers. And then finally, and my favourite bit of the session, I'm going to be giving you my top tips for having conversations with young people about gender identity. So I'm going to be sharing some direct work ideas and then also some reflective questions for you to take away for kind of yourself and also to have in kind of tandem with your supervisor and reflexive supervision. And then at the end, we should have some time for questions as well. Okay, so my name is Charley. My pronouns are they, them, which means if you refer to me in a sentence, you should be using they. So some examples are, this is Charley, they are a social worker, they're newly qualified. They live in London with their partner and dog. Just some examples for you. And I've also put up this social graces kind of pinwheel flower thing because I'm going to be returning to this idea of like a visual representation of social graces later in the PowerPoint. And I think it's important also that I give you a bit of context for myself as well, just beyond the idea that I'm non-binary, because my experience of gender identity is massively impacted by my ethnicity, my whiteness, my age, my level of education, where I grew up and how I grew up, and also massively tied into my sexuality as well. So, genderqueer. I've got quite a lot of examples. Sorry, I'm getting messages. Quite a lot of examples of what these terms mean up here. I'm not going to run through all of them because I don't think we have the most amount of time. But I wanted to put them on the slideshow just so that if you want to return to these slides and learn a little bit more, then these resources are all here for you. And then to the right, we've got a genderbread person, which is a great idea for direct work as well, which I'll come back to. So when we say genderqueer, we are thinking about gender identity in a way which is kind of experienced or expressed aside from the normative understanding of gender as kind of being assigned male or female at birth and experiencing your gender as what you were told that you were when you were a child. So it's an umbrella term which describes any experience outside of that norm. So it can cover transgender, non-binary, agender, bigender, and is basically kind of, yeah, an umbrella term and could probably be used interchangeably with trans. But I wanted to kind of foreground that idea of queerness, queer as like queer pride, an experience of queer pride, and then queer also as kind of like an ostracization from normative understandings. So yeah, the short version is it's kind of the same as trans. So your gender identity being different to your sex that you were assigned at birth. So I was assigned female at birth, but I don't identify as a woman. I'm non-binary and transgender. I experience my gender queerly, which might have slightly confused you too much there. But yeah, if we think of it as kind of trans, then yeah, that should make sense. So I've put these next few slides together to kind of capture a little bit of the transgender context within the UK at the minute. So this slide, we have a bit of the media and political attitude to trans children. In my view, we live in an environment which is hostile, suspicious, policing of people's gender expression and identity, and at times it's outright violent. So we've got examples here from the media, from social media, politics, and NHS policy as well. And then to kind of speak about the impact on that, I'm going to tell you two stories of two young trans women. So on the left here, we have Alice Littman, who died recently, and her family have been campaigning since her death for an understanding of the conditions which led to her choosing to take her own life, which includes extremely long waiting lists for the gender identity clinic, which means that she didn't have access to gender affirming care, such as pronouns or surgical transition. And unfortunately, her mental health, while on this waiting list, was such that her only choice was she felt that she had to end her life. And then on the right, we have Brianna Gay, who is a 16-year-old girl who was incredibly sadly stabbed by two other young people. It's unsure if it was related to her transgender identity, but I wanted to bring these stories to your mind as kind of an example of like the real life impact of the hostile environment towards trans people that we live in at the moment. I think also it's really important to say on this slide that the majority of, or kind of disproportionately, transphobia, trans hate crimes, hate speech is targeted at trans women, and especially trans women of colour are massively impacted by transphobia and kind of the political and social media context of transphobia in the UK at the moment. And then to kind of summarize what trans young people are facing at the minute. So transphobic hate crime has almost tripled in the last 5 years. LGBT youth in general are more likely to be homeless, but this is massively increased if you are trans or a person of colour. Mental health is a really important issue in the trans community at the moment. According to a Stonewall study, 92% of trans young people have thought about ending their own life. 84% of trans young people have self-harmed, and 45% of trans young people have attempted to take their own life, which is a massive figure. Trans young people face social and familial exclusion. So not only are they sometimes subject to transphobia and like being removed housing by their families, but their peer groups and school groups can also exclude them for their gender identity or expression. Public policy, we touched on quite briefly in the last couple of slides. So in the inquest into Alice Littman's death, the young trans woman who took her own life after being on the waiting list, the kind of coroner found that gender identity clinics are currently treating people who were referred 5 or 6 years ago. And if the rate of treatment continues at the same rate, then someone referred today would have to wait 20 years before having a first appointment with a doctor to access hormones or medical transition of some kind. And finally, I think it goes without saying that trans communities live in a state of collective grief. Every trans person I know has lost someone. I've lost someone. I see my trans friends discussing the hate crimes and hostility that they experience daily, weekly, and we're all trying to stick together and like support each other. But I think we also all live in a state of collective grief. So with that being said, you might be thinking, God, it sounds terrible to be trans. Why would anyone be trans? And to that, I would say, first of all, it's not a choice to be trans. You just kind of are trans. But secondly, that there is a great deal of joy in being trans as well. So I wanted to share some of these images with you, partly also for myself. After talking about that heaviness, I need to remind myself of like some of the trans joy that exists. So it's not all doom and gloom. It's wonderful to be trans. It is wonderful to discover something about yourself and share that with the people that you love. Some of us might have heard of the term gender dysphoria, which refers to when you feel kind of uncomfortable or pain about the way that your body looks or the way you're perceived by others. But the opposite of gender dysphoria is gender euphoria, which is that kind of feeling of, yes, this is it. This is how I'm supposed to feel and look and be perceived. And one of the loveliest examples of that is Elliot Page here in this picture at the top. He had top surgery, which is where breast tissue is removed and gives the appearance of the flatter chest. And he's got the biggest smile on his face that I've seen in years. We've also got a picture from Trans Pride. And I love this caption of love, rage, and solidarity. I think that kind of sums up the trans pride and protest experience. And then two kind of not photos, like drawn images of too queer for your binary, which I love and relate to, and gender is a universe, which is a lovely, beautiful expression of how gender is experienced, not as like a spectrum from male to female, but as disparate stars and points in a galaxy and a universe, and everyone's gender is unique. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about kind of our responsibility as social workers towards trans young people. So BASWA released a position statement on social work with transgender people. And one of this key quote is, BASWA recognises and stands in opposition to the stigma, discrimination, oppression, stereotyping and abuse that many trans people experience. Taking this position is entirely in line with our code of ethics. So BASWA have said quite clearly that they are in support of trans people and against the kind of hostile environment that trans people are facing. And from that same document, the position statement on working with trans people, they've kind of bullet pointed, well, I've bullet pointed, they outlined, I bullet pointed some of what social workers can and should be doing in relation to trans people. So we should be upholding dignity, advocating for trans rights, personalising practice to individuals, which hopefully my next section will give you some ideas for, considering intersectional outlooks on the trans experience, and understanding how gender identity and transitioning issues affect people at different life stages and in different contexts. And I wanted to share this picture as well and talk about it briefly. This is from someone I'm in community with who took this picture at a protest, and it says, "We don't want cis kids to be trans, we want trans kids to become adults," which I wish I could just like put this in a like envelope and mail it to every politician in the country of like, we're not trying to turn kids who are cisgendered into trans or gay or whatever the kind of media hysteria is in the moment. We just want trans kids to become adults, have access to gender affirming care, not experience hate crimes or murder, not feel like the only option is to end their own life. We want trans kids to grow up and be happy and healthy and thriving. Just going to take a drink quickly. So my next section is about working with young people. So I've got some tips with you for kind of starting that conversation. So ask about pronouns and share your own if you're comfortable. This can be a really helpful conversation to have when you first meet a young person, but if that ship has sailed and you're already in work with someone, then you can bring this conversation up at any time. But I would just be conscious that you're asking these 3 different questions. So how do you want me to refer to you when it's just us? What about in front of your parents? And what about to your school or with people in my office? Because sometimes you'll get 3 completely different answers to these questions. And a young person within the safe space of your personal relationship will be happy to be referred to as a preferred pronoun, but not be out to their school or their parents and ask you to refer to them as something else. When you're told a new name or new pronouns that seem unfamiliar, practice them. So write practice sentences like I did at the beginning. So like, this is Charlie, they're a social worker. Use the pronouns with a colleague, have a conversation, sit down for a chat and just be like, I just want to practice a pronoun quickly, practice a name quickly. Like, this is not something that's unusual. When I've had friends who have told me a different pronoun or a different name, and it's taken me a little while to get used to it. And I just practice with another friend of, oh, so-and-so's got a new name now, let's just practice it so it's in our heads. And if you make a mistake, own it, apologize and move on. Potentially, if the young person wants, you could make a space for them to tell you how that felt to be misgendered or what they might need from you going forward. But if you can, try to not center your own experience in that. Like, it can be embarrassing. We feel uncomfortable, we feel shame, we feel like, oh, I had one chance to gender them correctly and I got it wrong. But try and keep those feelings to yourself and be present for the young person rather than kind of, saying all of those things to them. And finally, I've got some direct work tools for you. So there's the gender-bred person that we had on one of the earlier slides, which can be a really helpful tool for yourself and for young people to think about kind of the differences between sex, gender identity, gender presentation, and its links to sexuality. And the Gender Unicorn is a similar resource. And then if you're a little bit more creative in your direct work, I've got an idea for you, which I'll show you on the next slide, kind of incorporating the social graces daisy illustration to find out what's important to a young person. And then finally, don't make assumptions. I think when I first started working with trans young people, I was like so excited because I'm so passionate about this that I would maybe assume that for them, their transness was like the most important thing about them and they'd really want to talk about it and it would be their highest context. But actually, that's not always the case. For some people, them being trans is the least interesting thing about them and they want to talk to you about mental health or housing or familial conflict. So try not to make that assumption. Don't make the mistake I did. So this is an idea of a direct work activity around kind of what makes you you. So you can take the social graces petal thing, the flower, whatever you want to call it, with you and talk through it with a young person as a way of explaining like these are things that we think about when we think about how we move through the world, the privileges that we have, the disadvantages that we have, and invite them to tell you which of these things are important to you and then draw that in a daisy if you want, like the social graces thing. So I've shown you one that I've done for myself of like, okay, I've picked out the social graces that are most important to me. And then here they are in a kind of visual representation. And we can talk about those as kind of like an idea of what makes you you, what makes me me, which of these things are most important to me. And then finally, I have some questions for yourself and in supervision. So in self-reflection, you can ask yourself, what ideas do you have about gender? So if you're a woman, how do you know that you're a woman? Which is a really difficult question to answer if you've not thought about it before. So it might be worth like using this as a journal prompt or something like that. So where do these ideas come from? Where did you learn what a woman is or what a man is or what a trans person is? When and where is gender most important in your life? When do you feel most aware of your gender? So an example for me is every time I would be catcalled, I felt incredibly aware of my gender. And just because you're not trans doesn't mean your gender isn't important to you. And then how does gender intersect with your other identities? Does this intersect with your ethnicity, your culture, your sexuality, your class positioning? And then, yeah, okay. In kind of reflexive supervision with a supervisor, you can kind of discuss some questions around how you're showing up in spaces with this young person and how you're working with them. So what do you understand about working with genderqueer young people? How comfortable do you feel talking about gender identity? Why might that be? What stories do you have about gender that might be coming up for you? Why might gender be important to this young person? And how might gender be intersecting with other aspects of this person's identity? What is their highest context? And if you don't know this, how can you find out? And I think, yeah, that is everything. There we go.
Thank you, Charlie. That was amazing and really comprehensive. So I've got a couple of questions. The first one is from Amy, and it says, do you have any tips, guidance on working with young people who are just beginning their transition and are neurodivergent, namely have ASD, which I think is autistic spectrum disorder?
Yeah, and I think there's actually a really high correlation between being autistic and having kind of a non-normative experience of gender or sexuality. I think for me, if they're at the start of their yes, I will share the slides. If you're at the start of your transition journey, I think especially for young people, like it can be like a foray into lots of new and exciting things, and gender identity, pronouns, names can change quite a few times. As a practitioner, I would maybe kind of foreground like, cool, I hear you're telling me this is your name and your pronoun right now. Just want to let you know if that ever changes. If you want to be known as something else, just let me know. I know these things can be like moving and changeable. Yeah. And then I think a young person would really enjoy thinking in depth with you about gender identity using one of those direct work tools like the gender unicorn or the gender bread person, as a way of like exploring themselves and getting these terms clear in their own heads as well.
Cool. Can I ask a question? Because there isn't one in the chat right now. So some people are on a learning journey as professionals or individuals with the concept of different gender identities. How best can we address mistakes that we make, if clumsily or otherwise?
Yeah, I think for me it's kind of what I was saying there about kind of, not centering yourself in that discussion, and like making sure it's about the young person's feelings and not about your own feelings of shame or guilt, because then the young person is kind of in a position of having to be like, oh no, it's okay, don't worry, when actually it might not be okay. And it might have really, really hurt them. Especially and maybe this is something to consider, that like if a young person is upset by that, like it might not just be you, like they might have been misgendered 500 other times today and experienced other types of transphobia or transphobic abuse, and it could just be like the final straw. And for me, I would say like, oh, I'm so sorry, I've just used the wrong name for you there, haven't I? I know your name is X, or oh sorry, I just used the wrong pronoun, I know your pronouns are Y. And then maybe use it again a couple more times in the conversation so that they are kind of reaffirmed by that. And maybe open up a space of, I'm really sorry that I did this, do you want to talk about how it felt for you when I did that, or what you might need from me going forward, to kind of help us move forward relationally from this kind of blunder that I made. Yeah.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Okay, we've still got time for questions. Somebody put into the chat that they use the Burnham's Graces diagram to get the voice of the child. I don't know if they want to comment on that, or if you've used that, if that is helpful.
Yeah. I think it's really helpful. It's a really helpful way to kind of visualize something that, I mean, I don't even have all of the graces clear in my head of what they are. And I think having like just a print out that you can just have in your like toolkit of, these are some of the things that I'm thinking about when I'm trying to consider you as like a whole person. Which of these things are important to you?
Thanks. Sean has asked a question. It says, how best can social workers support young people who are still on their journey of discovering who they are or might not yet have the right identity words?
I think that's a really good question, and something that I've been thinking about myself lately as well, in terms of like, I find that I don't talk about gender enough with people who aren't trans, and I'll tend to have quite in-depth conversations about gender with young people who are non-binary or experiencing their gender queerly. But to kids who are cisgendered, so the same gender as what they were assigned at birth, I don't have those in-depth conversations as much. And I think something that I'm trying to do more is have those conversations with every young person, not just trans young people, of like, and I think it's about kind of laying the groundwork for that safe space as well, of like, I'm thinking about gender, I'm a person that you can talk to about gender identity. And yeah, using those worksheets which do kind of explain quite simply the differences between being cisgendered and being transgendered. Yeah, so kind of guiding that conversation and creating a safe space would be my like bottom line.
Thank you. I have an excellent question here. Oh, another one's popped up. So this is from Finja, I think, or Finja. I'm trying my best not to mispronounce it. It says, do you have advice for talking to parents who are struggling to accept the gender identity of their child?
Oh, this is a really difficult one, and one that I'm maybe not actually the best place to answer, because I struggle more with this question as a non-binary practitioner, and find that if I'm out to parents, or if I'm just kind of perceived as kind of queer in some way, whether I look like I look like a butch lesbian, or I've got like my rainbow lanyard, like those conversations can be quite hostile for me in a way that they aren't potentially for other practitioners who don't like look or present so queer. So I'm not sure I'm the best place to answer that, but I think to kind of give some headlines, it would be like, maybe reassuring them that it's a change, but your child is still the same child. What do you love about your child? What do you want for your child? And kind of highlighting that what you love about them hasn't changed because their gender identity has. yeah, but I'm not the best placed person to answer that, I think.
Thank you. Maybe hopefully some of the resources that we'll be sharing afterwards might lead people to find answers. Okay, I think we've got final questions. It's 29 minutes past. It's first, Amy says, I had a conversation about pronouns with my said young person the other day, and it appeared they understood what I was asking, but did not engage and want to share. They stayed silent, though they had previously said they don't like to be called a young man. Shall I say, so should I stay gender neutral in referring to them, or continue to refer to them as him, he, him among professionals?
That's a tough one because I think you have to take the young person's lead. And it's difficult because if you have kind of, and we all do it, this isn't a criticism, but if you have assumed that their pronouns are he, him, and then haven't actually clarified with this young person, do you want to be referred to as he? It's difficult because if you're having that conversation with professionals and you're referring to them as him, you've kind of based that on an assumption. But also, if the young person doesn't want to share, it does leave you in a difficult position of how do I refer to this person? And I think my instinct would be thinking about how, as a practitioner, I can create a space that feels safe enough to share that. And maybe those questions of how do you want me to refer to you when it's just us versus how do you want me to refer to you with other professionals would be really helpful there, because it might be a different answer and the young person might not be ready to come out to the school or the parents and just want a safe space to kind of explore their gender identity with you alone.
I just want to say thank you so much. It was amazing. I've really enjoyed it. I've learned so much, and I look forward to also receiving the resources that you very kindly curated for everyone. So thanks to Charley.
Thank you, everyone.